February 2024. A deep UV lithography machine leaves a Dutch factory floor, bound for Shenzhen. The paperwork is clean. The export license is approved. The buyer isn't hiding. It's called the Shenzhen International Quantum Academy, and it says so on the door. Nothing about this sale broke a single rule. That's the part that should bother you more than if it had. It took a Dutch investigative program, not a U.S. intelligence agency, to surface it almost 2 years later. Newsur dug through confidential ASML records and found something else buried alongside it. A second sale, this one to a subsidiary of the China Electronics Technology Group Corporation, a state defense conglomerate that runs China's only national laboratory for military computer chips. ASML sold them a component too. Also legal. Also missed. Here's why that matters to you, whether or not you've ever thought about lithography machines. ASML doesn't just make chips slightly better. It makes the machines that make the chips that run everything downstream of it. Your bank's fraud detection, the AI model your company just licensed, the missile guidance systems neither of us will ever see. There is exactly one company on Earth that builds extreme ultraviolet lithography systems capable of printing the smallest transistors humans know how to make. It's Dutch. It's ASML. And for 2 years, while Washington built an entire policy architecture around denying China access to that capability, ASML's own paperwork shows the company was selling adjacent, sensitive hardware to a Chinese quantum institute and a Chinese military lab, and calling it compliant. By April 2026, someone in Washington had finally read the file. U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick began a series of private meetings with ASML's senior executives, according to people familiar with the discussions. The concern wasn't really about the quantum sale anymore. That story had already surfaced. It was bigger. Officials told Bloomberg they had information suggesting ASML exported equipment tied to EUV systems, including the specialized transport hardware used to move the machines themselves, in a way that may have breached the Wassenaar Arrangement, the multilateral treaty that's supposed to keep EUV out of China entirely. ASML says no. The company circulated a document in Washington insisting none of its 314 operational EUV systems, or the 26 decommissioned ones, are on Chinese soil, and that it can detect any unauthorized movement automatically. Maybe that's true. But the company said something similar about the quantum sale too, right up until a Dutch newsroom proved otherwise. So here's where this actually sits. Cold and simple. A company that holds a functional monopoly over the machines the entire AI era runs on just spent 2 years insisting its export controls work, while its own confidential files kept saying otherwise. Washington noticed. The question now is what they're going to do about a choke point they thought they controlled, and whether that choke point controls itself. To understand why Washington is suddenly nervous about a company it's relied on for a decade, you have to understand what ASML's monopoly was actually built to prevent, and how much of that prevention has already quietly failed. Since 2019, when the first Trump administration pressured the Dutch government to block an EUV machine SMIC had already ordered and paid for, the entire American strategy has rested on one assumption: deny China the tool and you deny China the chip. No EUV, no sub-10 nanometer transistors, no frontier AI hardware. It's a clean theory. It also assumes China would simply wait. It didn't. SMIC now produces wafers at what's called the N+2 node, roughly 7 nanometer class performance, using deep ultraviolet machines and a technique called multi-patterning, where the same layer gets exposed multiple times to fake the resolution a single EUV pass would give you. It's slower, it's more expensive. Yields are worse than TSMC's. But it works, and Huawei's Ascend 910C chips, built partly on this workaround, are shipping in the hundreds of thousands. In 2025, a Chinese lab called Zhipu AI trained a 744 billion parameter model entirely on Ascend 910B clusters and landed near parity with Western frontier models on standard benchmarks. Nobody needed a smuggled Dutch machine for that. They needed a decade, a lot of DUV machines already inside the country, and patience Washington didn't budget for. Now walk into a secure facility in Shenzhen. Reuters reported in December that China had built a prototype EUV machine inside a high-security lab there. operational, not yet producing functional chips, completed in early 2025. The team behind it includes former ASML engineers. One of them, Lin Nan, left ASML to lead a group at the Shanghai Institute of Optics and Fine Mechanics that's now running China's first laser plasma EUV light source platform. Firing a 1-micron laser at a solid tin target to generate the exact wavelength ASML's machines have spent 20 years perfecting. In a paper Lin co-authored in December 2024, the team argued solid-state lasers could eventually replace the carbon dioxide lasers ASML relies on. That's not a rumor. That's a named engineer, a named institute, a published paper. This is the open loop from Part 1 closing a little. Those 314 EUV machines ASML swears are all accounted for outside China. That number was never really the vulnerability. The vulnerability was always the people who used to build them and the components that don't need a full machine to be useful, a DUV lithography sale to a quantum academy, a transport system export under scrutiny, a former ASML engineer with a tin target and a laser. None of it requires breaking Wassenaar. It just requires exploiting everything Wassenaar doesn't cover. There's something almost funny about the timeline here, if you squint. Washington spent years building an export control regime specific enough to stop a single machine from crossing a border. And China's workaround didn't need to move the machine at all. It just needed the knowledge that built it. You can put a lithography system on an export ban list. Nobody's figured out how to put a person on one. Now for the part that complicates the tidy version of this story, because the tidy version is that ASML got caught, Washington is furious, and the walls are closing in. The real picture has more friction in it than that. Start with the number that makes ASML's position genuinely uncomfortable. China was ASML's largest single market in 2025, accounting for 33% of total revenue, with roughly 20% of projected 2026 revenue still expected to come from Chinese customers. This is not a company that can simply exit the relationship because Washington raised an eyebrow. Every euro of that revenue funds the next generation of EUV research, the same research the U.S. wants to keep out of Chinese hands. ASML is, in a very literal sense, financing its own chokepoint with money from the country it's supposed to be blocking. That's the tension nobody resolves cleanly, and it's why the Dutch government's response to the Match Act, the bipartisan U.S. bill that would bar ASML from exporting even DUV equipment to China, has been closer to alarm than agreement. The Hague's position is that the bill hands Washington unilateral authority over what a European company can sell, backed by the threat of cutting ASML off from U.S. components, software, and customers if it doesn't comply. European capitals are reading that as extraterritorial overreach, not counterterrorism. So while American officials frame this as ASML failing to police itself, the Dutch government is framing it as Washington trying to police someone else's company. Here's the reversal, and it's worth sitting with. The assumption underneath this entire story is that if ASML tightens its export controls, China's semiconductor progress slows to match Western expectations. But Chinese industry insiders are already citing 2030 as a realistic target for producing working chips from their domestic EUV prototypes. Western intelligence assessments put commercial viability closer to 2032 or 2035. Even in the best case for Washington, total, perfect enforcement. No more quantum sales, no more ambiguous transport exports. China's lithography program keeps moving on its own timeline. It just moves slower. The choke point was never a stop switch. It was a speed limit, and even that assumes ASML's controls actually hold, which the last 2 years suggest they don't, not completely. And underneath both of these threads sits a Chinese national strategy paper, signed by executives from SMIC, YMTC, and NORA, among others, calling openly for a coordinated national effort to build what they describe, without irony, as China's ASML. That's not a fringe ambition floated by a state newspaper. It's the country's own semiconductor leadership admitting the current approach. Piecemeal breakthroughs, imported components, workarounds stitched together department by department isn't enough. They want the whole stack, domestically, inside one framework under the current 5-year plan that runs through 2030. So the honest verdict at this stage isn't ASML failed or China won. It's that both governments are now negotiating with a company that answers imperfectly to both of them, and neither Washington's leverage nor China's workarounds are as clean as either side's public statements suggest. So where does this actually land? Not the headline version, the real one. ASML isn't a villain in this story, and it isn't a victim either. It's a company sitting on top of the most consequential choke point in modern industry, trying to run a business inside two governments that both believe they own a piece of it. The Quantum Institute sale, the CETC component, the transport system scrutiny, none of these prove ASML deliberately armed a rival. What they prove is simpler and honestly more unsettling. A monopoly this important has been operating on an honor system, and the honor system had gaps nobody found until a Dutch newsroom went looking. Here's my read on where this goes. Washington tightens the rules further. The Match Act, or something close to it, eventually passes in some form, because the political pressure after 2 exposed sales is too strong to ignore. ASML complies, loudly, publicly, and loses a real chunk of that 20+% of revenue it currently books from China. And China's domestic program doesn't stop. It keeps moving toward that 2030 target, using the DUV workarounds it's already mastered and the former ASML engineers it's already recruited, because the knowledge that left the building in someone's head was never covered by an export license in the first place. If I'm wrong about anything here, it's the timeline, not the direction. Maybe Beijing hits 2030, maybe it's 2032. The gap between a working prototype and volume production took ASML itself over a decade to close, and there's no evidence China gets to skip that part. But the assumption that a tighter export list solves this, that's the part I don't buy anymore. And after 2 years of finding out what ASML's own paperwork actually says, I'm not sure Washington fully buys it either. The uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of it, the US built a strategy around controlling one machine, and it turns out the machine was never really the thing that mattered. The people who know how to build it were. You can put a lithography system on a restricted list. Try writing an export ban for a physicist with a laser and a tin target. I'll wait.